first thing that's different, obviously, is you always use the parent's perspective. So you would never do a project analysis just from the subsidiary level. Okay? The biggest reasons for that, mentioned on this slide, are tax reasons. Obviously, taxes are going to be a lot different at the subsidiary level than they are at the parent level. So that's a big reason. We'll go through some of those differences. There could be restrictions. The earnings at the subsidiary level are not necessarily the earnings at the parent level. So that would change your analysis because you're going to discount cash flow, and earnings are a big part of that cash flow. Obviously, the exchange rate, when you submit those earnings to the parent, right, and you have to adjust the value to the exchange rate, that's a big difference. And then maybe one of the biggest reasons of all is, just like you learned in 30/40, the shareholders own the company, and they're at the parent level. So you always want to make sure that what you're doing is profitable and adding value to the firm at the parent level. Okay. So that's the big, some of the important reasons there why we don't use the parent's perspective. Don't do it from the subsidiary perspective. In this chapter, we will always assume that the subsidiary is wholly owned. Obviously, it would change it if it wasn't. So we won't deal with that. We'll just assume it's a wholly owned subsidiary. So this slide just kind of goes through and shows you how very different the earnings can be starting at the subsidiary. Obviously, that subsidiary pays taxes to the home country or to the in-country, whatever country it's in. Then you end up with your after-tax cash flows to the subsidiary. Then they're going to retain a certain amount for their own operations in the host country. So then you'd have what's left over after what they retain to be remitted to the parent. Sometimes there's going to be a withholding tax on earnings that are remitted. So there's another tax complication. Then after that, you have what you can remit to the parent, which then has to be converted into the parent's currency. So you've got the conversion difference. And finally, you have earnings submitted from the subsidiary to the parent. So you can see from that whole process, earnings of the subsidiary are doing the same thing as earnings of the parent. Okay? So that just kind of justifies why we're going to use the parent's perspective. Okay. See if there's anything else I wanted to mention. So obviously for any net present value analysis, you start out with a forecast. And you have to forecast a whole bunch of things. Revenues, expenses, taxes, depreciation, all that stuff. In 30/40, it's kind of like project analysis to me is like creating a mini income statement just for that project. So you project out your revenues. How do you do that? Well, you have to come up with what's the demand for the product going to be and what's the price for the product going to be. So there's tremendous detail in coming up. You have to try to estimate inflation over the life of the project. What's that going to do to your revenues and to your expenses? So there's quite a bit of detail that goes into these forecasts. So we'll split it up into time periods. At time 0, obviously the big considerations are the cost of the project and any working capital requirements. So you probably recall that from 30/40. So those are time 0 cash flows. Obviously, then you've got to come up with revenues. Revenues are not only going to be impacted by demand and price of the product. Is there competition in that marketplace? You have to look at their pricing. What are the economic conditions in the host country? So is that going to affect demand? Right? So it's a whole economic analysis. You have to come up with fixed and variable costs. Fixed would be rent, utilities. obviously you have to be familiar with the tax laws within the host country, the host country's policy for remitting funds. Some countries won't let you remit. They'll make you maintain a certain amount of earnings within the country or for a certain period of time. So you have to be familiar with those types of policies before you can do an exact analysis. Obviously, you have to come up with an exchange rate forecast. If this project is going to last 3 or 4 or 5 years, right, and the subsidiary is going to be remitting earnings, your company has to either pay for or come up internally with its own currency forecasts. Salvage value. What, if anything, is going to be the value 3, 4, 5 years down the road of this project? Is there anything you're going to be able to sell? Plant equipment, and if so, how much is going to be worth? Okay. So we'll talk about salvage value. And then finding required rate of return, which in 30/40 you learn as weighted average cost of capital. Okay. Well, there might be some differences here because remember for 30/40 you learned not only how to calculate WACC, but a really important point that we teach in 30/40 is the discount rate has to reflect the risk of the project. So if there are any other risk factors within that host country, you've got to try to capture that in your discount rate for that project.
So let's take political risk as an example.
Yep.
How would you measure this? Do you approximate that? Okay, so since we have a political risk, obviously the expected return will be higher.
Right.
Right,
and that's a really good question. And if we have time this semester, for those of you who might be interested just in thumbing through chapter 16, they do really a pretty good job of how to measure political risk. So you can access, we don't have time obviously to get there, but you can, Standard & Poor's does a pretty good job, and there are other entities out there that focus on measuring and putting out periodic reports on political risk that corporations will face by entering different countries. So that's one point that you would always do some research on, is you would literally try and measure. And they have obviously expertise over the years, and they follow political risk and economic risk very, very closely. So there actually is a way to measure it. And then try to incorporate it into the higher required rate of return.
Isn't it just as simple as like adding the country risk premium to your WACC?
You know what? It can be, but that's very subjective. And usually what we're going to do today is go through a bunch of different scenarios that, a lot of people, because it is easy just to, but do you add 1 point, 2 points, 3 points, do you know what I mean? It becomes subjective if you just increase the discount rate. So a lot of people will prefer to try and estimate the risk by looking at various risk factors and identify which inputs to the process are the most at risk, and then to make your decision based on what we would call a simulation analysis or scenario analysis. So it's obviously a little bit of science and a little bit of art, but you can just increase your discount rate. But that can be tricky because even sometimes increasing it 1 percentage point can have it, change your decision to go or not to go. And is that 1% really appropriate? It's kind of tough to put. Another way to do it that might be a little bit less subjective would be perhaps to find us, like if there are competitors in the host country, find a similar company selling the product you're going to be selling in the country. Estimate their beta, and then right from their beta, estimate the capital asset pricing model, the required rate of return you can have. So you could try and figure out the volatility of the similar company in the host country. That might be a little bit less subjective. So there are different ways you could go about trying to be more precise about what kind of discount rate you should use to reflect this.
Are you taking like an average of like the subsidiaries beta and like your home country's beta? Like, are you taking betas from different areas in And then averaging them out, and
You could, but
using
you
that?
probably want to look at betas of competitors that were already
Yeah.
operating, like if you're just entering a country,
Yeah.
right? Or considering entering, you'd wanna look at the betas of companies already operating within the country.
And then are you
That would probably be more appropriate than just looking at your own, beta of your own, multinational corporation. That probably wouldn't be as reflective of the risk.
oh, okay, so you're not taking like a weighted average of the different betas.
That wouldn't be as exact, because really you want it to reflect the risk of this unique project, not necessarily the multinational.
So do you take the beta of foreign competitors who have subsidiaries in that country,
That you're looking about entering.
Yeah.
into,
or the country that the headquarters is already in?
Not necessarily the headquarters.
Okay.
If you're looking to go overseas, it would be most appropriate to try and measure the risk in the country you're looking to enter. So you wanna look for competitors in that country. Just because their earnings you could already measure beta, stock price, right, all that kind of stuff. And that would be as close as what you might expect to face when you start up within that country. So that would probably be a lot better than just saying, I'll tack on another 2 or 3%. Okay, let's see. So in this example, we're gonna go through today, the company is called Spark, and they're considering opening a subsidiary in Singapore to manufacture and sell instruments. And so they've asked their various departments, manufacturing, marketing, finance, to provide relevant information to help them put together this net present value analysis or capital budget. Let's see, they've met with government officials to discuss various tax laws, earnings remittance, etc. And they think the project will last for 4 years. Okay, so once they gather all this data, they believe that the initial investment will be 20 million Singapore dollars. They've given us estimates of the demand in units and the price per unit, and you can see they've included inflation in their estimate because that price goes up. Their variable costs they've given us in each of the years. They've given us fixed costs, tax rate, remitted funds. There's going to be a tax of 10% withholding tax on remitted funds. Initially, guys, this is what we're going to call our base case. Okay, we're going to assume the spot exchange rate for the Singapore dollar is flat at 50 cents for the life of the project. We think we could sell, we have a salvage value, we'll be able to sell plant and equipment for 12 million Singapore dollars at the end of the project, and we feel the required rate of return is 15%. Okay, so those are just, that's the base case. And the question is, once we throw all this together into an NPV analysis, should we go ahead with this project? Okay. So take a look initially at these spreadsheets for the 4 years. We'll just kind of walk through the 4th year has all the data in it. So you've got your demand and your price of the product, which gives you your revenue, that's line 3. You've got your variable cost per unit, you'd have to multiply that by the demand in line 1 to get your total variable cost in line 5. Annual lease expense of $1 million, fixed annual cost of $1 million, depreciation of $2 million, and that gives you total expenses on line 9. So let's see, line 10, before tax earnings at the subsidiary level, they took revenue minus expenses to give you $8 million. From that, they have to pay the host country a tax rate of 20%, which gives them after-tax earnings. And then they add back depreciation as you'll remember from Finance 3040, how do you get to cash flow? Cash flow is net income plus depreciation, so that's why you're doing that. One of the ways, there's actually 3 different formulas that can get the same answer. So that's why they added back depreciation. What line is that?
Sir, what's this formula again?
Cash flow.
The one on the board?
Yeah.
Net income or earnings plus depreciation. And we want to depreciate, we want to discount cash flow in our net present value analysis. Okay, so now I'm on line 14. Singapore dollars remitted by the subsidiary, 100%. So that gives, that's our 8.4 million, but we have to pay a 10% withholding tax on that. So after the withholding tax, we'll remit $7,560,000 Singapore dollars. Now, at that point, because this is the final year we're looking at, we will sell what we can, 12 million. We will convert that into US dollars at 50 cents exchange rate. Now, I'm gonna slow down here. I don't mind this presentation. I do it a little bit differently. If you'll grab your calculators. This is okay. I mean, it's descriptive. So look at line 19. You've got your cash flow in here. That's the important line. Cash flow is what we want to discount. We don't discount earnings. I'm just kind of repeating Finance 3040. We discount cash flow. Okay, so that's line 19. Now, what they've done here, which I'm not going to do, they've present valued individually each one of those cash flows. That's too much work. We're not going to do that. But it's fine. And then on line 21, you've got your initial investment of 10 million US dollars, because remember it was 20 million Singapore dollars. And when you converted that 20 million Singapore at the 50 cents, you got 10 million. So that's your initial cash outflow on line 21. And then they took line 21, which is a negative amount, and then they added in the present values on line 20 to get the line 22. But I'm going to show you kind of a little bit less complicated way to get the answer. So in your calculators, if you'll clear everything out, make sure you're in one payment per year mode. We're going to put these cash flows in. So we're going to take the negative 10 million and enter it in your CFJ. That's your initial time for cash outflow. Now I'm taking the rest of the stuff, you guys, from line 19. Okay, so what we've done is we've entered all the cash flows right off line 19. So you've created a timeline within your calculator of all the cash flows. And you've told it discount all those cash flows at 15% the required rate of return. And then when you hit function key, which is your red or your orange key, whatever, net present value, you should end up with 20, that lower right hand number, 2229,867. How many of you got that? Anyone not able to get that number? Okay. So is it a good project? Yeah, why? It's a positive NPV. That goes back to 3040 also. Positive NPV means it's a take on, you accept any project that's positive. You reject any project before it's negative. Okay? So comments or questions just on this base case? Alright, so that's kind of what your calculator has done for you. You've got your initial cash outflow times 0. And then your calculator discounts each of the other positive cash flows and adds them together, nets them, and there's your net present value. So that's what we just went through. Quick and easy on that. Okay, so this is a good project. That's what we found out. Now what we want to do is we want to do some, what I call scenario analysis or simulation. We want to just change one item at a time and see what it does to the viability of this project. Okay? So some of the things we're going to change. One at a time. We'll attempt to come up with best and worst case scenarios. And then make a decision on whether or not this is really going to be a good project, given, you know, how sensitive it is to the changes of various variables. So the first thing we're going to change is exchange rate. And then maybe we'll try some hedging in terms of forward rates on some of the cash flows to lock them in. So we'll change a bunch of things and take a look at the NPV each time we do it. Okay, so the only thing in this one that we've changed, you can see, if you look there, is the exchange rate. And we have two different cases here. We have a strengthening Singapore dollar, and we have a weakening in the lower kind of half. We have a weakening Singapore dollar. And they've just brought over lines 16 and 17 at the very top there of that original base case. And then they altered just the value of the currency. Okay, so you've got still your 10 million initial cash outflow, and you've got cash flow to the parent on line 1, 2, 3. So you can see how those cash flows are now different. So grab your calculator and just practice. Put in the negative 10 million again, and then enter those new cash flows from line 3. The 22,916, 3,078,000, 4,172, and 12. And how many of you were able to get 4,875,754? Anybody? Okay, and if you were to do it again on the cash flows using a weak Singapore dollar scenario, what if the Singapore dollar weakens over the time? Then all of a sudden you get that negative net present value. Okay, so the base case says yes, it's good. A strong Singapore dollar scenario says yes, it's good. But a weak Singapore dollar scenario says no, you shouldn't do this project. So we're going to take that into consideration. Well, then we'd say, okay, well, let's talk to our forecasting department. What are the probability? What is the probability of a weak Singapore dollar? We have to do some research there. Well, if the scenarios came back, if the probabilities came back, very, very strong chance that it'll be strong, you know, moderate chance it'll be stable, and not much of a chance at all that it'll weaken, then we aren't as worried about that negative net present value. So we do have to try and, look at the probabilities of weakening versus strengthening.
So with that, would you just multiply like the NPV number of each of the likelihoods by the weight?
You could do that. Or just say, there is a 5, 10, whatever the department tells you, % chance that the Singapore dollar will weaken. There's a 95% chance this is gonna be a great project. And again, sometimes it just comes down to the risk profile of the management. Are they willing to take on that 3, 4, 5% risk? Can they stand it? Or is there a way they can hedge so that they aren't subject to that small risk? Maybe they do that. Okay. Now on this example, actually, you guys, it's correct in the text, but years 3 and 4 are off, so I just want to focus on years 1 and 2. If you look at line 19C, we'll go through years 1 and 2 and I'll explain to you what they've done in this scenario. So on line 16, they just brought it over from the base case. But in 16A and B, they've hedged, not 100% of the cash flows, just 4 million of it. So 4 million of the 5.4 million, and they left the rest unhedged with a forward contract. Okay, that's how they hedged. So if you go down to line 18, on line 18A, your forward rate they're going to lock in is 48 cents, and they've gone back to the base case where the Singapore dollar on the unhedged is going to be 50 cents. So that's where lines 19A and B come from. The hedged cash flow, they took line 16A, which was the 4 million, and multiplied by the forward rate of 48 cents. So that's how they got the 1.92. And then with the unhedged, they just took line 16B and multiplied it by 50 cents to get the 7. Then they added those together and they have a new line 19C, total cash flow to the parent. And again, when they do this NPV, this number is actually incorrect because they made a typo in year 3 and 4. But when I corrected for that, the net present value of this scenario was a positive $2,001,467. So with hedging, this is an even better project. It's positive 2 million. Okay, so we can keep that in mind as we're going through trying to make a decision on this project. Here's another scenario where it's positive. We already talked about the fact that you have to be very careful and to try and include inflation in not only your revenues but your cost estimates. That can be critical if you don't include it. And one thing that, I don't know if you remember this 30/40, but I'll remind you. If you don't include inflation, what you're dealing with is not nominal dollars, but real dollars. So then what you'd have to do is discount, not at your nominal required rate of return, but your real rate of return. So inflation is really a critical piece. You don't want to forget to. If you're in a country where there's super high inflation, it's true that the currency might depreciate, which we said in past chapters. That could have an offsetting effect. Okay, but that's why you would do scenario analysis, just to see what is the overall. Okay, other things we could alter, which we'll look at here in the next scenario. What if the parent company is going to do some of the financing, as opposed to the subsidiary level? That could, reduce your foreign currency risk because you're dealing in US dollars. And number 2, that is a big difference on international projects, which kind of initially took me by surprise, because in 30/40 we spend a lot of time saying you don't need to include financing costs in a net present value analysis, because the capital budgeting and the financing decision are always kept separate. That's what we tell you in 30/40. A project has to be viable, standing on its own merits regardless of how you pay for it. So that's retarded. Well, in an international analysis, we do include the financing cost, the interest expense, if there's debt involved, okay? Why? Because it changes the cash flows from the subsidiaries to the parent, and it changes the tax impact. So that is one really big difference, is that you would include, interest expense from debt, financing costs, in the international entity, but you wouldn't do that to this. Okay. So in this next scenario that we're gonna look at, we're gonna have the parent, what if, we're gonna do a what if analysis. What if the parent, increases the initial investment from 10 million to 15 million, and, the subsidiary won't have any loan or lease payment, we get rid of the lease payments of $1 million a year, and therefore, the salvage value is gonna go up from, 20 to 22. Or excuse me, 12 million to 22. So that's what we're gonna look at. What is the impact? And everything else goes back to the base case. The only change, we just change one thing at a time to see how sensitive the project is to that one item. Okay. So let's look at these numbers. Alright. So on this slide, take a look at line 6, you guys. That used to be $1 million a year lease expense, now it's 0. So that's one of the changes. Now take a look at line 17. That's your salvage value. It's gone up to 22 million Singapore dollars. And then take a look at line 21. It used to be 10 million, now it's 15 million is the initial investment by the parent. So those are the 3 items that changed by having the parent put up more money up front and get rid of that lease expense of the subsidiary level. Well, when you put these numbers from, again, line 19 of cash flows to the parent into your calculator, but this time, go ahead and try it. Put in the 15 million as your negative cash outflow. Your times 0 cash outflow is negative 15 million. And then grab your numbers from line 19 for your positive cash inflows. And discount at 15%, you should get that 1,116,425. How many got that? So, good. So even at the parent level, it's still a good project if the parent invests an additional $5 million and gets rid of the leases. Still a good project. So under a lot of these scenarios, we're probably feeling pretty good. So far, the only one that came up negative was the weak Singapore dollar scenario. What if the host country blocks some of our funds? That means they won't let the subsidiary remit to the parent. Well, let's take a look at what happens to the net present value in that case. So let me explain to you what they're doing here. Alright, so that those dollars at the top, dollars remitted by the subsidiary, we can't send them home. So they have to stay in country. So the assumption is, okay, we'll keep them in the host country, we'll invest them in some sort of a money market instrument, safe, we'll be earning some return on them, and the interest rate they've used is 5%. So grab your calculator and I'll show you what they did. We'll work backwards. So start at that 7.6 million as your PV. Put it into your present value key, 7.6 million. For 1 year at 5%. 1N and 5 assumption. And then solve for the future value. How many of you got 7,980,000? Okay, so that money money stays in the host country for 1 year at 5%. Well, go back now to year 2. The 6 million from year 2 stays in the host country 2 years before it can be remitted. So you clear out your calculator, put in the 6 million as your PV, 5% is your interest rate, and it stays for 2 years, so 2 is your N. And then you solve for future value. And that's how they got the 6,615,000. And then the last one from year 1 would stay in the host country 3 years, and they earn 5% a year. So that's just the assumption. Is if the funds are blocked, we're only gonna earn 5% on them. And then we take them all back to the 4th year, out to the 4th year, I should say. And so at the point in time when the project is ending, those monies will be almost 30 million Singapore dollars. And then we just go through the same process. So now, clear out your calculator, here are your cash flows. So you have to put in the zeros because you weren't allowed to remit in year 1, 2, or 3. And then all that huge, big remittance comes in year 4. And how many of you get the 1,133,944? So it's still a good project. Even if the host country won't let us remit any earnings, it's still a go. Okay, comments or questions on that? Okay, well, let's look at one other scenario. Probably one of the biggest, most important factors is salvage value. Because there you're trying to forecast or estimate the future value of what you could sell this project for at the end of its life. And usually salvage values are large, and that means they're critical to the positive net present value, to the viability of the project. So I really like this kind of analysis. It's called break-even salvage value. And we're gonna walk through it. This little equation here answers the question, what is the minimum amount I have to be able to sell this project for at the end to just break even? Because then I can compare it to what I think I'm gonna get, and if the two are really close, then I'm kind of nervous. But if the two are really far apart, I'm really comfortable. So let's take a look at this. Here's what we're doing. We're taking the initial outflow, which is the investment that you make at time 0, that's the IO. And we're gonna subtract the sum of the present value of all the cash flows we think we're gonna receive, excluding salvage value, not including salvage value. So that number is gonna be probably a negative number that I need to recover from my salvage value in order for this project to be acceptable. But the last step that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna multiply it by 1 plus my required rate of return. K is my WACC, my required rate of return. And I'm gonna take it out in this example to the 4th year. Because I wanna know how many Singapore dollars do I need to get to be able to sell this for at time 4. That's why we multiply by 1 plus K. Okay? And that's called break-even salvage. So let's take a look at an example. Actually, I'm not sure I've got a slide up, so I'm going to show it to you on the board. Okay, so this is line 19, you guys, that we've been dealing with, the cash flow line. And this piece right here represents the sum of the cash flows discounted at 1 plus required rate of return to the T. So that's this piece. So grab your calculator. I'm going to show you how to do this on your calculator. You put in 0 CFJ and then all your cash inflows. Okay, so do that for me. Then how many of you get the 8,799,246? Okay, so that's just the present value cash flows. So now we're going to subtract those cash inflows from the 10 million cash outflow. Can somebody tell me I didn't write it down? What does that give you?
$200,653. Yeah, that's it.
And then what?
So 1200.
653.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. All right, you guys, so that's what we need to recover from the salvage value, but that's in present value dollars. Well, we want to know it in time 4. How do you do that on your calculator? This is your PV. %, for 4 years. Solve for the future value. And then you got 2,099,900. Okay. So now that is the time 4 amount that the salvage value would need to be. Only 2.1 million roughly. That's way lower than what we think we can get. Way lower, so that's a break even. So if all we could get for our salvage was 2.1 million, it would be an okay project. It would be a break even project where we earn 15%. But we think we can earn a whole lot more, or sell it for a whole lot more than 2.1. So that means this is going to have, obviously, a very positive net present value. And we're feeling pretty comfortable with our analysis, because even if we were wrong, if you go back to that base case, we thought we'd get 12 million Singapore dollars. Well, that's a lot more than 2 million. So we could be wrong by half. What if we only got 6 million Singapore dollars? We'd still be fine. So with all these different scenarios, and you can keep doing them. Well, what if this? Well, what if that? Right? Change various variables within that base case. And then we only have come up with one negative net present value. And our finance department didn't think there was a very high probability of a weakening Singapore dollar. So everything is pointing toward this looks like a pretty good project. So that's kind of, you know, scenario analysis. Change one thing at a time and look at the sensitivity, look at the impact on the viability of the project, okay? And that break-even salvage is a great way to analyze a really important piece of the NPV analysis. Okay. Other things you would want to consider. And in Finance 3040, we call these indirect effects. I don't think our author calls them that, but that's what we call 3040. What is the impact of this proposed project going to be on our current sales of tennis rackets, right? Is it going to cannibalize any of the current sales? Then you'd have to include that cannibalization in those cash flows. If we're going to be selling more in Singapore and fewer wherever in the heck else we sell them, you've got to include that indirect effect. So that would be another consideration. You know, some projects might increase the sales of other existing products that we sell. So they can also, you know, have a synergistic effect where they increase sales of other products. Well, then you'd include those positive cash flows. But you'd want to be really wary of cannibalizing other sales from other products. Other things that you'd have to take into account, what if the host government is really wanting you to build that plant there, so they're giving you some tax breaks or, you know, cheaper land or cheaper buildings or whatever. All those things would have to go into the final analysis. So take a look at this scenario. This says we think we're going to lose $1 million a year in the sale of tennis rackets here at home. So they reduced line 19 cash flows by $1 million US dollars. And now, when they do net present value analysis, this is no longer a good project. Yeah.
So are they just losing $1 million because they're no longer now exporting it from? Okay.
Yep. Yep, some of those sales are gonna move to the subsidiary. Now it's not a good project. That just blew a hole in our hole. We were feeling so good. But now we're like, holy crap, this might not be a really great project. Okay, so that's something big to consider. You would reject it based on those cannibalization estimates. Let's see. We've already kind of talked about real options just means any other opportunities or benefits the host country is giving you in terms of land or other discounts. You know, they've said, oh, if you'll come here, you know, we'll allow you to purchase this additional land for, you know, 50% discount. So those would be other real benefits that you could receive from the project. Okay. So this is kind of where we started off. You know, some analysts will just adjust the discount rate. It's probably the least recommended alternative. It's kind of like using a sledgehammer. It's just not very fine-tuned. And it's garbage in, garbage out. You get that discount rate wrong, and your whole analysis is really at risk for not being very exact. So it's very arbitrary, it's very subjective, it's very dangerous. Just to say, I'm going to increase my discount rate by 1, 2, 3, whatever percent. Okay? But you'll see some people do that. Sensitivity analysis, what we've just done, is a much better way to go. And your book doesn't really discuss it, but what we were discussing with beta analysis is probably a much better. You find a similar company, calculate their beta, their volatility, right? You estimate their capital asset price model, their discount rate based on capital. Come up with kind of an adjusted discount rate based on the volatility of those cash flows. So that would be probably a much better way. Now, one thing we didn't look at, we did sensitivity analysis, quite a few. That's where you change one thing at a time to gauge the importance of each variable. But through computer simulation, you can change many variables all at once. And then do it hundreds or thousands of times and come out with a probability distribution of what all those changes going on at the same time are. So it's a much more dynamic form of analysis, but obviously we don't have the resources to do it here in class. But that is another option that you would have in the real world to try and better estimate what is the probability that this is a bad project. But really what it comes down to in terms of what we've done is my worries would be the cannibalization of the weak currency. And I'm not that worried if my finance people said there's almost no chance of a weakening Singapore dollar, then all I'm worried about is cannibalization. And that in and of itself can destroy the project. So you might have to then look at ways to alleviate that cannibalization, and if there isn't a way, you probably reject the project. Right? So just really, that's the benefit of scenario analysis one at a time. Cannibalization ended up being the thing that could signal. Everything else looked great. Oh. Let's take a look at the map. Some of the end of chapter problems. Okay, let's take a look at 13. Says Brower Inc. just constructed a manufacturing plant in Ghana. The initial cost is 9 billion Ghanaian cedi. They intend to leave the plant open for 3 years. Cash flows are gonna be 3 billion, 3 billion, and 2 billion. The cash flows will be remitted back to the parent at the end of each year. And at the end of the project, they expect to sell the plant for 5 billion cedi. They need a 17% return. And it takes 8,700 cedi to buy $1 US. And the cedi is expected to depreciate by 5% per year. Determine the NPV for this project. Okay, so I want you guys to take a minute, and I want you to set it up in this kind of a format. Kind of like the slides that we just went through. I want your cash outflow times 0, I want all your cash flow, positive cash inflows at times 1 through 3. And they've given you the cash flow, you don't have to really deal with any of the detail prior to that. But I do want you to convert it from SETI to US dollars. And then I want you to do an NPV analysis of 17%. So take a minute and try that, and then when somebody has an answer, we'll go through it together. Anybody have an answer?
I got negative 26.
It is negative, but it's not 26,000. What did you get for your initial cash outflow at time zero in SETI, or excuse me, US dollars?
1,034,482.
43.